Welcome. Happy Thanksgiving. Episode 22 now. We're getting there. Of The Breakup, a show that takes a look every day at the psychological relationship, right? Well, any relationship, I suppose, is psychological. So it looks at the relationship we have with money. And what it is about is not a Bitcoin markets show, right? Like buy Bitcoin at this price because X, Y, and Z. It's not that. What we're looking at is the relationship that people have with the money, the spirit of the money, for lack of a better word, and how it manifests in the world around us and how Bitcoin can change that. So it's essentially contrasting two really interesting books, one called the Fiat Standard, which is sort of a book that looks at the consequences of the US dollar being the global reserve currency and what that's meant, and then contrasts it with the potential of the Bitcoin standard, and what that will mean for the world going forward. So we're not here just to dunk on fiat necessarily, right? We recognize it as an innovation. It was a wonderful thing back in the 1950s and 40s when everything first started. But what we do here is take the frame that we're in a fourth turning, right? We're in and if you don't know what the fourth turning is, it's, I guess, a frame for history, right? So if we look at history, we have a tendency to see it as just this linear progression, and it spans hundreds, thousands of years. What the fourth turning suggests is that history is quite cyclical, almost like seasons, and that you can view history in the case of the book, very admittedly Anglo-American history. So they do not suppose that it lines up everywhere around the world. They believe it to be an Anglo-American outlook. And what it suggests is you can look at history in 80-year blocks. And if you go back to the Revolutionary War, you jump 80 years, you get to the Civil War, you jump 80 years from there, you get to World War II, and you jump 80 years from there, and you find yourself in 2021 in what I call World War III. Now, World War III is not what we would think of as World War III before, as in like hot war between different countries like China and the United States. That's sort of the World War II and World War I mentality. Although those countries may fight in World War III, I'm not predicting they don't. I'm predicting it's not really the struggle of World War III. The struggle of World War III, from my perspective, is really nation states themselves armed with their dollars and the global reserve currency system, and its relationship with individuals. So World War III is about a recalibration for me, a recalibration of an individual's ability to interact with the state, particularly when it comes to the financial relationship that they have, right? So I'm talking taxes, I'm talking about, in this case today, diplomacy, because I want to give thanks. It's Thanksgiving in America, and we love Thanksgiving. I'm born in Canada, but my kids are all born in the States. I lived in the United States for years. My grandparents, one side is American, so great grandparents, I should say. But raised their kids in Canada. I guess that's what was going on back then in World War II times. A lot of Vermonters, I guess, would move up to Canada. Myself and the family are going to head back to Vermont to farm and do all kinds of fun sovereign individual homestead stuff. More on that. We'll probably cover it on this show from time to time. But today on The Breakup, it's really about Thanksgiving. Small countries are what we're thankful for. Small countries, right? We love small countries. And the reason we love small countries is what happened in El Salvador today. The theory of the so going back to the fourth turning, we're in this cyclical 80-year thing. Even within those 80 years, you can kind of divide them up into 20-year periods. That's why it's 80 years. That's the length of generations, so we say, right? So what we're essentially talking about in this show is destroying the world that our grandparents built, right? Just wiping it out because it's garbage and doesn't serve our purposes anymore and isn't good for us. It was great for them, right? For a lot of them, not everybody. That's why a lot of the movements, social movements in the 60s happened, because they were reacting to what was perceived as a perfect America in the 1950s. And it only was perceived as perfect because it had the momentum of these new institutions that hadn't had entropy set in, which is what we're dealing with today, right? We're dealing with the entropy of these systems and their inability to solve the very problems that they were designed to solve. So we are very enthusiastic about small countries. And the reason is the sovereign individual thesis, which is what I think the result of the fourth turning is, right? This World War III, the reformation of the individual and the relationship with the state, recalibration of the state itself, right? Really, what it does, what it's competent for, and so what we're arguing is if we take the money away, it totally recalibrates the state, right? If we take away the spirit of the money, the way it's created, uh, basically the Bretton Woods fractional reserve or central banking Federal Reserve system, which is sort of deployed throughout the world. Now, I have a tiny bit of experience in this, in the sense that I live in Barbados in the winter, and it's a small country. So I gave a talk to them last winter. So one of the weird things about Barbados is their money is basically a U.S. dollar stablecoin, right? They don't really have monetary policy. Their money, the Bajan dollar, is just always two times the U.S. dollar, right? So it's pegged, as we say. So the Hong Kong dollar was pegged, I think, 7-1 to the U.S. dollar. There's a bunch of currencies around the world that are essentially U.S. dollars, or although they're in different packaging, but they're essentially U.S. dollars. And then take El Salvador, which is an extreme case, which didn't even put the new packaging, right. El Salvador just went U.S. dollar because their own currency failed many years ago. So they didn't even put the packaging. Other places like Argentina had pegged their peso years ago to the US dollar. Policy failure, fell apart. But a small economy like Barbados can get away with it because we're dealing with, not nearly the type of volume. So, in general, policymakers seem to have been able to keep it pegged without the speculative attacks that go on with the peso in Argentina or other currencies that are more dubiously pegged because it's a much more complicated relationship. But Barbados is a small country, and the people there have one infringement that comes with this stablecoin business, which is they have more or less capital controls. They can't take their Bajan dollars off the island as easily. They're not easily convertible to US dollars at large amounts, and then they can't really leave the system so easily, right? So China deploys the same thing to be able to have a lot more control over their peg with the US dollar, because it is pegged in a way. They buy US debt and make sure that the Chinese dollar stays, or the renminbi stays, quite low, so that they continue to export and be a nation of manufacturing. One short-term pivot here, and you should pay attention to this. This is a prediction, right? That a lot of the stability of the US dollar comes from that relationship right there, the stability that we've known until now. But the instability in the US dollar, I think, will happen when those Chinese manufacturers stop having as much faith in the US dollar as the means of payment. Because, for example, there might be some inflation over the 2 months or whatever it takes the contract to settle. So if you do start seeing, and I do think that's what's going on with a lot of the shipping, right? I mean, it looks like a lot of the shipping was solved by the Biden administration this time around with the penalties they put on getting rid of the empty containers. First of all, they're empty containers because there's a trade imbalance, right? We're not really exporting as many things as we're importing. We're trying to export food. I'm not one of these people who believes that America doesn't produce anything. America produces all the food, right? Amazing amounts of food. We just don't produce a lot of the plastics and computers, important high value items. But I think food is going to become a much more important commodity for production than we've ever realized before. So I'm not too worried about what America produces necessarily, but I will, remark that the Biden administration solved a lot of the empty containers going out, piling up at the ports, which was apparently one of the main reasons why there was so much backup, and some of the supply chains were getting stressed out in America. So the theory is, if they don't take U.S. dollars, so they got rid of that stuff. They cleared out the ports of the empty containers, but over in China, they're already charging a lot more for shipments out of the country, right? Because they're worried about the instability of the dollar. So if that perpetuates, you're gonna see the U.S. dollar already wavering as a global reserve currency, because it's not really useful for settlement of international trade, especially when there's a huge delay in shipments and things like that. So watch out for that. But that's not really what we're talking about today. That's a little more speculative. What we're talking about today is really the IMF and the CCP and something called debt diplomacy, right? You've heard debt diplomacy before. If you haven't, what it basically means is you loan a little country money, and once they're in debt to you, they have more restricted policy options, right? So they begin to have a restricted policy option that forces them to perhaps cut healthcare, education, other things in order to meet their debt obligations. So the criticism of the IMF over time and debt diplomacy is that the strings attached nature of loaning money to a small country requires them to make policy decisions that the IMF isn't necessarily that interested in or care about. And in the end, those things get manifested in healthcare, education, and other what would be important fields to any domestic policymaker, but they're suddenly stripped from them and they're unable to enact policies with as much sovereignty as they would like, right? So that's part of the argument. Now, the IMF actually began as part of this Bretton Woods arrangement. So in order to install the US dollar as the global reserve currency, huge policymakers around the time of World War II met in New Hampshire at a hotel not far from where I am right now. I've been many times, actually. I drive there on the way to Maine to go enjoy the ocean, which is not too far from me. So I passed right by the hotel, and beautiful place. I think Bitcoiners should actually buy it and do something with it, just out of audacity, because it looks a little, it's like one of those hotels that was built so long ago. We could probably use the reno. My idea is to buy it and just only serve beef in there. Only serve beef as a bulwark against the soy-based diets that the IMF is starting to promote. So. Oh, just one second. So here's a quote from John Maynard Keynes. We talk about Keynesian economics all the time. This show is not about comparing economic systems. I just want to point out, I don't care about Austrian school or Keynesian or modern monetary theory. People can study it. I've studied it. I'm very comfortable in all those subjects, but I don't think it's actually an accounting issue. I don't think that the economy is really about math. I don't think that if we can prove that Austrian school using math is better than Keynesian economics, that somehow the world is going to adopt Milton Friedman's ideas and all that stuff. My theory is that whatever system works for the greater amount of people, it's a psychology engine. This is a Scott Adams riff, but I only see the economy this way now, as psychology engines that can perpetuate, because basically people get security, people get wealth, people get various things from perpetuating these systems. And that my argument is Bitcoin is just simply a better system and will gather the momentum needed and gather the forces and energy needed, because the psychology engine of Bitcoin is very easy to understand, right? One Bitcoin is always worth one Bitcoin. No policymakers are going to affect your personal wealth. And it really brings savings, right? The ability to save back into the mix, because what ended up happening with our fractional reserve system, IMF and all this stuff, is they treat debt, future money, as equal to money in the present, right? Great thing at the time, an innovation. I'm not discounting what Fiat did 100 years ago and in the ensuing years to alleviate global poverty, and it was an amazing innovation, second only perhaps to Bitcoin. Bitcoin just being that much better. But at its time, an amazing innovation. But as we can see, entropy sets in because it's a human-based system, right? It's all these, mechanisms, human-based mechanisms that made the dollar work for so long, and that's the psychological energy that's running out things like the IMF, right? They just don't work anymore. So what I'm arguing is the psychology of it is going to fail to perpetuate the system, because you're only getting people who are drawing a paycheck, whereas in Bitcoin, you're getting folks like me who are kind of self-tenured, that have been around in Bitcoin for a long time, and it's not really about wealth necessarily at all, actually, anymore. It's about helping spread this message and treating this as actual wartime, right? And that from me personally, I continue to believe that the early Bitcoiners are essentially the D-Day folks, right? And they'll be remembered as such, because to me, in this World War III situation between countries, individuals, recalibrating our relationship, the emergence of the sovereign individual from that tension, right? From that change, it's Bitcoin that can allow it to happen simply because we're bringing savings back into the mix, right? So currently, because of the manifestations of fractional reserve banking and the financialization, right, that future money treated as current money, right, debt treated as current money, has actually perpetuated a system where financiers have too large of an effect on the economy, let's say, right? And because they have such a large effect on the economy, Wall Street folks and all the rest of them, particularly the foreign exchange currency traders, right? Particularly them. So what ends up happening is, the money that they are basically creating within their own circles, right? Within their own circles, within the closed circuit of finance, with all of the different parties that you have to pay, and the parties that want to profit, and the parties that are acting in their own interest, which is normal, right? We don't want to change human nature in Bitcoin. We're okay with the selfishness, but the problem with the selfishness manifesting in Wall Street as it is today is that you're creating a wealth gap that in the end makes it so that folks simply can't keep up with the burdens of debt, because debt is what's running this whole system. Some people have no problem with debt. Others have a lot of trouble with it, because in the end, saving money is just not an option. You're dumb. Like, if you save US dollars, you're an idiot, right? You're stupid, because it's naturally being inflated. They want you to invest. They want you to play markets. They want you, I mean, the system wants you. When I say they, I mean the system. I don't even mean one individual. I mean, you just have to now, because the train left the station, and the money is such that all that future money that was printed and put into circulation in the present is working, and usually working for some people and not others. So anyone who has access to debt, rich, right? That's literally the definition of wealth now, access to debt, because you can get debt and grow your wealth. If you can't get access to the debt, you got to just live paycheck to paycheck, right? And saving in that environment, kill yourself. You're an idiot. Like, I mean, actually put a gun to your head and shoot it, right? Because you're not going to make it, right? You're not going to make it. Better to go into debt or buy Bitcoin, because Bitcoin in the end is bringing that back, right? So if you're saving dollars, I don't literally mean kill yourself, right? I mean, just stop saving, just spend it, get a fucking credit card at this point, right? But if you want to save, just save Bitcoin, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to lower the IQ level required to just maintain what you have. It's the old Alice in Wonderland line. In this place, you have to run just to stay in one place, and you have to run twice as fast to get ahead, right? So that's what we've created now in our system, and that's why the psychology will break down. But it also plays out, and that's the point of today's episode. Big country celebrating its big holiday. But I want to celebrate today, and I'm thankful for little countries like Barbados, like El Salvador, right? So what happened to El Salvador is they created this new Bitcoin bond. So first of all, they've said Bitcoin is the national currency, a national currency, along with the US dollar. So it's putting them right next to each other. They're competing. Now, the IMF has said after this weekend that, okay, we're done. America broke off relations, by the way. They just said, we're not going to do it anymore this weekend after this new Bitcoin bond. So El Salvador created a Bitcoin bond, right? $1 billion Bitcoin bond. The IMF said, don't do it. You're stupid. We're not going to lend you any money, blah, 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 blah. You can't, pull the rails that you've laid for Bitcoin out of your banking system. The government in El Salvador has also partnered with a Bitcoin wallet. IMF has a problem with that. I don't know much. I downloaded the wallet. It's still not working great for me. I've been trying to play around with it. So I don't have any comments on IMF's statements about the wallet, but I don't think they're the same kind of criticism that I gave. My problem with it is a bit of the functionality and user experience. But I haven't used it. I've just played with it, so I wouldn't know exactly. And I try to pay attention to what's going on down in El Salvador. So here's what Keynes said, right? Here's what Keynes said, to go back to the small countries, big countries, and keep it, tight to here. Keynes said, in their eyes, the fund should have, so this is in 1944 as they're setting up the IMF. And when he says in their eyes, he means in US banking's eyes. In US banking's eyes, the fund should have wide discretionary and policing powers and should exercise something of the same measure of the grandmotherly influence and control over the central banks of the member countries. That these central banks, in turn, are accustomed to exercise control over the other banks of their own countries. This is how the game to control the economy of the borrowing country is played by US in cahoots with the IMF. So this is from Keynes himself, the godfather of this entire system. Like, he's admitting, probably the right thing at the time, right? To fight the Cold War and all that. I'll even say it, probably the right thing at the time. That the US central banks can have the grandmotherly influence, use the control over domestic central banks to control commercial banking. The same way that the Federal Reserve can control commercial banking in the United States, right? So that's what he's saying, right? Now, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has learned the same trick, right? And they're doing a lot of this debt diplomacy. So the thing is, they're able to exercise policy controls over small countries, and they have for a while, right? That's how the US dollar is used to control policy in countries, and has been, admittedly. I don't think anyone denies it, and it's not controversial. The IMF, as a proxy for US power, is able to influence foreign governments. A lot of the things that were set up after the World War II, I'm not going to write an essay about it, but the UN and a lot of these other institutions were really just there to hide US hegemonic global imperial influence. They didn't want to be like England was in its time and said, if we create these international things, they won't look so poorly on us, and maybe it'll be better than it was, right? Because America is always caught between that tension, right? Either revolutionary power or imperial force. And it can never really choose between either of them, right? And that, is similar to America itself. Whitfield Diffie, the guy who invented public key cryptography, said this once, and I'll never forget it. Someone, another great cryptographer, sort of criticized Bitcoin to him and said, if these Bitcoiners, and this was like in 2015 or something, if these Bitcoiners could just figure out, if they want to be the one currency of the world, the new US dollar, this thing, or they want to be a cypherpunk revolutionary tool, right? Which one is it? This cryptographer said they can choose, but they have to choose one or the other. And Whitfield Diffie entered and said, wait a minute, America has never had to choose whether it's a revolutionary force or an imperial power. It sort of gets to do simultaneous. It sort of gets to be those things simultaneously. Why can't Bitcoin be the same? Why can't those kids who are working on Bitcoin, he said that at the time, just, keep developing? And in the end, we have, right? There's revolutionary power and a new form of, I wouldn't call it imperialism because we're not trying to enact any top-down power or policy control, but it certainly ushers in a new form of global governance because it wipes out the old one. So I don't think Bitcoin is necessarily caught in that imperial tension, but the range is similar, right, of America. It can be two things at once and not have to choose. But the US in the end, right, with the IMF, effectively had to choose, right? Just the nature of this relationship settled on the side of imperialism, right? It didn't really promote revolutionary powers of small countries. Right? It didn't do that. It really was a hegemonic relationship. Maybe not as top down as it could have been. Maybe not as top down as this one is shaping up to be with the CCP. So what the CCP did, they took a book, they took a page out of the IMF book, and they're doing it with the Belt and Road stuff, right? Which is the infrastructure to recreate the Silk Road on land, so that there's trade routes and infrastructure and in ports from China all the way to Europe. So the huge pan-continental Eurasian trade route, physical trade route. So what Beijing ends up doing is, places like Pakistan, Djibouti, the Maldives, Fiji, they all owe huge amounts to China. And any one of these who default on those loans end up surrendering physical control of the things the Chinese lended them money to build, ports, railroads. So they build this infrastructure, lend you a bunch of money to build it. And when you can't pay, they'll physically take over that infrastructure. And so they really encourage, this is a Rex Tillerson quote. Beijing encouraged dependency using opaque contracts, predatory loan practices, and corrupt deals that mire nations in debt and undercut their sovereignty, right? So sovereignty is, again, one of the big pieces here. And China, if you take a look at what it's doing in Tonga, what it's doing in Montenegro, and in Africa to take over this physical infrastructure has already caught the attention of the Americans. So there's already some squabbling over U.S. military bases being close to ports that the Chinese may just be able to take over and all that stuff, right? But the point is, it takes away certain amounts of sovereignty. And it brings up this concept of a peon, right? Of a peon. So peon is it's the same as pawn, right? It's the pion. In French, we say pion is the name of the pawn on the chess set, right? But it also means, in English, you can use it. And peon is a form of diplomacy that I've just described with the IMF and this debt diplomacy, right? So it takes away your sovereignty over policies. And the lesson I end up giving for these small countries, and why I'm thankful for countries like El Salvador and all this. So when I was in Barbados, just before I left, that would have been in the month of May. It's a small country, Barbados, it's 300,000 people or something. And I spent a lot of time at a club for my children and, got to know everyone there, and was pretty quiet all winter there and was not really trying to get around. But of course, a small club, quite a few connected and wealthy folks went to that club, including folks from the Prime Minister's office in Barbados and all these other folks. So, they had asked me a little while into it to do like a private talk at this club for members of the government and members of the club and everything on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and most of that stuff. So I did my usual spiel, Bitcoin powered by the Lindy effect, let's say. So the length of time it's been alive, the length of time it's survived attacks, its decentralized nature, means it's savings technology, it's not consumer technology. It's a brand new innovation. All other cryptos, consumer tech, in the sense that the faster, the better, can still win. So that's a different game altogether. Play it if you'd like. Dangerous game, tough game. Bitcoin for savings, other stuff for investments, let's call it. But a separate worlds, let's say. So I gave my spiel, and at the end they said, well, what can a little country like us do, right? Thankfully, the whole, or a lot of the government was there. And what I said was, and I got lucky because that morning, the radio in Barbados, a lot of England people there, right? A lot of British people. The radio had just, I was lifting weights and at the weight room, had heard the radio telecast that morning saying that some English regulator, blah blah blah, in Britain had said again, it's the FATF, it's all these disgusting international groups, said, oh, Barbados is a money laundering nation again. It's where people go to launder money, right? So I heard that, right? Did the whole talk, and they say, well, what can a small country like us do? And my answer was, well, you can just tell those English radio people and these regulators to fuck off, pardon my language, right? Because they're a bunch of jerks. They don't really care about your country. They're just a bunch of bureaucrats patting themselves on the back because they created this ridiculous regime that isn't catching any money launderers, stopping any money laundering in the world, but they say you're not doing it. So apparently you're supposed to listen to them now. My advice to them then was start ignoring these people. Start saying, get the hell out of my face. You guys are scammers, right? That's more or less what El Salvador did. They've even got the Swedes telling them that something about the volcano is creating greenhouse gases, so they got to stop mining Bitcoin with it. I mean, it's absurd, right? You can't turn a volcano off. Like, it's not creating new greenhouse gases for the Bitcoin. It's a volcano, right? So the point is, I told Barbados, forget these jerks, ignore them, right? And I think they will in the end, and El Salvador is doing it. So in order for the sovereign individual thesis to play out, in order for us to win World War III, we're going to require some small countries to take a stand, right, to pave the way towards the sovereign individual, right? These sovereign countries are almost there. That was my advice to them. You're almost there. Because I'd given a talk about the sovereign individual basically in Barbados. And I said, look, I've talked a lot about sovereign individual today and where it's headed and why that's important. And you as a small country are so much closer to being a sovereign individual. I don't think we make it. We have Bitcoin. It's a lot. It's enough, probably. But we need these little countries to not kowtow to the CCPs, to the IMFs, and to all these other international organizations that would dilute their sovereignty and really bar the road for Bitcoiners to make it across the line, right? That's an important piece here. So if you do watch this show and you're from a small country, be thankful you're in a small country for now. And be weary of any one of these big, large institutions coming into your country to start telling you what to do, because it'll place you further behind in personal sovereignty if your country itself isn't able to exercise its sovereignty. All right, everyone, that's all I got for today. Thanksgiving. Going to enjoy it with my family. I got all kinds of smoked foods and roasted foods and all kinds of family coming over. So looking forward to it. All right, everyone, happy Thanksgiving. See you tomorrow.